Welcome back to PSA 1, The System, Part 4, Who? Who is in charge of the system? If you haven't seen the first 3 parts of this series, I would encourage you to start with the banks, followed up by brokerage accounts, and then the third part, the macroeconomic conditions, so you can get a general understanding of what I'm talking about, because I am going to reference those 3 videos in this video. Knowledge is power. Unfortunately, the system was designed so that leveraged knowledge is the path to personal wealth. That can be in the form of some sort of labor, some sort of skill that you've developed, or starting some sort of a business or some sort of an investment where you've leveraged your personal knowledge, plus accountability and the confidence to actually follow through with what you believe. The system was specifically designed by the people who are in charge of the system. And the system has a tendency to reward those who are most willing to be corrupted. We're being tempted. We're being lured by just that little thing you can get away with to get a little bit more money. This is by design. We are all being programmed to think this way. They use greed. They use envy, they use lust, they use fear as emotional tools and weapons that they use against us to get us to fall into this trap. Ever met billionaire with a B? I have had the opportunity to meet a handful of them. So when Jesus says that it's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle, I think I know what he means. It requires a certain amount of awfulness to do some of the things that it takes for some of these billionaires to become what they have become. And we all deserve the truth. And the truth is that hidden knowledge is how people get rich in this world, in the system. Why did it take me so much time and so much money to uncover these things that should be obvious to all of us? It's because deception is everywhere. We're being programmed. We're being told so many lies at so many fronts from so many sources that we grew up believing. Like the news, like the government, like all of the things that we grew up to believe, we now see that people have been put in specific places of power by their greed, and they are not doing good things with this power. And this journey of trying to figure out this monetary wealth system has taught me a valuable lesson. And that valuable lesson is that I have to learn when I'm being lied to. I have to learn to discern the difference between the truth and a lie, because they're not going to come out straight and tell you what they're doing when their plan is evil, deceptive, and hurts you. So how do we know when we're being deceived? How do we know what's true? Well, the truth is, the truth comes from God. It's simple. It's quiet. It's easy to understand. It just makes sense. It brings peace because it's given to you through love. However, where does deceit come from? Deceit comes from the father of lies himself. And how do you know when something is deceptive? Because it's confusing. It's loud. It's aggressive. It's border violating. Brings a sense of confusion and fear. And when you feel these feelings, that's when you know that it is an attack from Satan and there is something being hidden. If you have to create imaginary stories that are far-fetched to fill in the gaps of the story that you're trying to piece together, therefore denying your own reality of what you see before you, that's when you know that it's a lie. And the system was based on several lies, all interconnected. Therefore, it's confusing. It's intentionally confusing to make you give up. Meanwhile, you're working the rat race, so you're too busy to see what's happening through distractions, work, through media. So who did this? Who created the system? So to find out who is in charge of the system, we have to ask a couple of questions. First, who owns and regulates the banks? Second, we're going to ask who regulates and owns the brokerage accounts. We're going to determine the connection between all of them, and then we're going to figure out how they did this. So let's start with the banks. The large bank ownerships, when we cut out all of the red tape, the majority owners of the large banks are those who have majority shares in those banks. We're going to discover those people, exactly who they are, in just a minute, but just understand the concept. The majority share owners of the banks are the ones who have the most vested interest and primary rights to the corporation. Now, large banks are regulated by the central bank. And the central bank is a hybrid, like we discussed earlier. Central bank is a hybrid between government-ran and private-funded institution. And we know that the government politicians have a unique reputation. They lie, they cheat, they steal, but who are the individuals who are funding the central banks? You guessed it, the majority share owner banks. The majority banks are the ones who fund the central banks. And the majority share owner of the large banks, let's see who the majority share owners of Citibank, Citigroup, the global conglomerate that it is. Oh, Would you look at the top 3 majority share owners of this particular bank? These are the same people who own everything else. Let's see a different one. Who are the majority share owners of Wells Fargo? If you see here, it's the same top 3 who own Citibank. Isn't that interesting? Let's talk about JP Morgan. Do we see a rhyme or rhythm here of the top 3 conglomerates in the world, how they own all of the banks? And they also happen to own the regulating banks, the central banks, in a global central system. And they also happen to appoint politicians who we know are the filth of the earth to run this. Isn't it interesting? So as a general breakdown, we know that the large banks are owned by the top 3 conglomerates who own everything else, and that is the majority share owner of those banks. And we know that those majority banks, the large banks, are the ones who fund the central banks. And the central banks, if you whittle it all the way down to the very bottom, the Bank of International Settlements is the global central bank. So it's an upstream and downstream globally connected chain through the SWIFT system from the Bank of International Settlements to all of the various large banks and central banks around the world. And they all are owned by the same people, own every major corporation who produces everything that is public traded. So who owns the brokerages? Brokerage accounts. Well, there's a primary brokerage account, and that is the depository trust company. They own everything. They are the ones who own and manage all stocks. And they break it down through the DTCC down into the secondary brokers like Fidelity, Schwab, and whatnot. And all of them are owned by the majority stock owner, just like the banks. And it's the same people. So if we look at the depository trust company, primary subsidiary provides safekeeping and record keeping for securities. This is the DTC. DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, manages it all, and they source it out to the secondary brokers. Information is missing on the specifics of who owns this because it's such a well-hidden secret. But they are collectively owned by the financial institutions who own everything else. So how did they pull it off? How did they pull the wool over our eyes, and how did this one slip past the goalie? Well, we know that a few people own everything. And we also know that we as a generation have been tricked into passive investing. If you haven't seen part 2, brokerage accounts, I would suggest you watch that video where I break down what passive investing is. But it's essentially holding every security regardless if it meets the criteria to invest in. And as a result, these conglomerates now have primary control and power of your assets, of your retirement. All these accounts that we have collectively is in their pockets, and they're the primary owner of these assets. And they've lured us into doing it by tempting us with the 20% returns on the S&P. And through tricking and confusing, through education, through news, through media, through overcomplication by design, the financial planners. The financial planners don't even know what they're doing. It's almost like how the doctors are simply prescribing medicine because they're being paid by the pharmaceutical company kickbacks on prescriptions. It's the same mess that we're in. We can no longer trust doctors, and we can no longer trust our financial advisors because the educational system, in addition to all of our money going into their accounts that they manage and control, they've changed the laws over time. And all of these different laws that have been passed. Check out Peak Prosperity, where they do a very good breakdown of the wording that they used and how tricky and manipulative it really was from these lawyers who have been paid very well to do some very bad things. And as a result, you now have a residual claim on your assets, which would be your stocks and your dollars. All of it. You have a residual claim on the derivative wealth that you own or that you think you own. But we can't completely blame them because we fell victim to it, yes, but we chose to do it. We chose to be and easily corrupted as a society in general. I'm not saying that you did or that I did, but what I'm saying is collectively and partially individually, we have allowed this to happen through our laziness, through our gluttony. The fact that life is so easy these days to where all we want to do is scroll on our phone and be distracted with pleasure and the confusion surrounding us. If you look at many of the people who've been put in place in these high-level positions of power where they're getting paid very, very well, they've been corrupted. If you look at the Supreme Court, they've clearly been corrupted. If you look at these high-level government agencies and the people who are appointed to run them, appointed by corrupt politicians, it's really happening. The system has been placed from the top down in a hierarchy of power and control and deception to really pull the wool over our eyes, didn't they? So now that we know who's doing it, what do they want? Have they left us clues as to what they're working towards with this power that they've wielded against our will? Stay tuned for part 5. What exactly do they want, and what are they doing, and what is the evidence that we see before us as to what is happening? Until then, God bless.